Welcome to The Nation. I'm JESSY CHAHAL. We talk about global trades and how that is facing uncertainty as geopolitical tensions are reshaping supply chains, markets, and even economic alliances. Now, the ripple effect that causes is being felt across the globe, worldwide. Well, joining me right here in the studio to unpack economic implications for us all is NADIA JALIL, Economist. NADIA, welcome to the studio and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jessie. Glad to be here.
That's right. So much to talk about in terms of the reality of things. But let's start with the big picture, Nadia. The DG of the World Trade Organization has warned that global trading systems could descend into what he has termed quote-unquote chaos without any common rules. From an economist's perspective, how real are the risks that are facing us, and what would this chaos actually look like for global economy?
Right. So Dr. Ngozi Iweala, who was actually the Nigerian finance minister previously, is also economist from the World Bank, has actually iterated, I think this is probably the third time that she's mentioned the risk that the global trading system or the global trade itself could descend to chaos if global rules or global trade rules aren't abided by. How important it is to actually abide by these rules and have these institutions in place and standing strong and credible. I find it slightly ironic, though, that she's speaking about this from the position of Director General of the WTO, because who else is in charge of enforcing these global rules if not the WTO? The issue, however, is that even before, say, even Trump came on the scene, or even before the global trading system was disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, the global trading system itself, as embodied by the WTO, the rules that are set by the WTO, has steadily been eroded by the existence of preferential trading agreements, which are agreements between countries or between blocks of countries, such as the NAFTA or the US-China, was that one, or rather any agreements that we had with the EU, or recent examples include the RCEP and the CPTPP. So these are agreements that are beyond or outside of the WTO. So they supersede the rules of the WTO itself. So if the WTO is talking about rules being eroded, I mean, that already was in existence. What's happened now is that the descent into chaos, as it were, has been supercharged in a way with Trump announcing these unilateral tariffs, which are in clear direct contravention of WTO rules.
Right.
The issue now is, when you're talking about these rules or not being abided by, what are the penalties? We've not seen any penalties to the US. I mean, they are in contravention and they have been called to dispute resolution, but the countervailing force of that is that the US itself has a say in who appoints dispute resolution judges in the WTO. So the system itself has not been perfect for a long time.
Okay, so we're dealing with a system that needs some tweaking, to say the very least.
I would say complete overhaul.
Okay, complete overhaul. We'll come to Trump in just a
Sure.
moment. But how real are these risks that you've also highlighted in practical terms? I mean, if such chaos were to happen, what is it going to look like for global trade, and then particularly for a nation like ours? Could that trigger a feedback loop where uncertainty itself then amplifies economic disruption across perhaps, the region for us, for example?
Yeah, so the important factor to ensure the stability of the global trading system is obviously the stability and credibility of the institutions that uphold these systems itself. So apart from the WTO, how stable and credible are the bilateral trade agreements that countries have signed? How much can producers, for instance, and exporters and importers depend that the tariffs that are set for this year will be in effect, say, not just next year, but also 5 or 10 years down the line, because we've got a lot of products that need a long pipeline in order to produce, and product planning takes a long time. So the important thing really is in terms of how stable and how predictable the systems are. What I would say, and I hate to get back to this, but what Trump has sparked itself is the unpredictability scenario, right? So you can't depend. So one day it's 19%, another day it's 20% for these certain countries and other countries, and even for polar bears being tariffed for no reason. So that actually disrupts not just the trading system, but economic systems as a whole, the sheer unpredictability of it.
Right. So the framework or the structure that's meant to uphold it all, as you said, is in need of a complete overhaul. And then you have the likes of leaders, for example, Trump in this instance, who's also slapping on tariffs, and making it more difficult for nations or smaller countries or smaller trading systems. What is this doing to global trade? Is it just slowly fragmenting the entire picture? Are we slowly adapting to these changes? Are we in some sort of winds of change period right now?
Yeah, I would say that we are actually, hopefully, in a winds of change period, and these are friendly winds instead of, storms. I think what's happening here is perhaps, and what I've seen from geopolitical developments with Russia speaking to China and the EU declaring that they're now going to halt negotiations with the US in terms of their tariffs.
Right.
That the trading system is realigning itself, perhaps away from the US. I mean, we have to remember that, yes, the US is a huge global economic and trading power, but it's not the only global economic and trading power. In fact, for Malaysia, the US is actually our third largest export partner after China and Singapore. So, and next to that is the EU. So that it's not like the world does not have any options left. And I think we keep forgetting that tariffs, in essence, actually hurt domestic consumers more than they do importers. And I think there was a lot of news reports after the unilateral tariffs come out that Trump supporters were surprised to find that it wasn't exporters who were paying the tariffs. Right? It was them that were paying the tariffs. It's import duties in a way.
Right. So now, if we look back about less than 100 years ago, about 90 odd years ago, during what was known as the Great Depression, global trade was relatively fragmented. But fast forward to our current settings, economies are deeply, we are joined to some extent, integrated as well in terms of supply chains and more. But any shock to that overall system can propagate. It can make that shock travel faster in terms of tariffs, border closures, even conflicts that can end up or result in ripple effects. How resilient is our modern day independence if, say, you said that US is sort of our third largest we export to, we've got China, Singapore, and even the EU as an entire bloc. What does that say for modern day independence if we were to, quote unquote, separate ourselves from some of these superpowers?
I don't think we can separate ourselves from these huge global economic powers completely, right? Because we are, in essence, a small open economy.
Right.
But there are opportunities to build into regionalism and localization. And I think we had this conversation started during the pandemic when it was found that, yes, whilst the global value chain was an efficient way of producing items and goods, particularly when it comes to the electronics and electric sector, as well as all our daily goods, it wasn't very resilient when it came to risk because everything was too integrated in a way. So if anything happened in one part of the supply chain, then all other parts would fall apart, essentially. There was no redundancy built into the system. So I think that certain producers have probably started to build in those redundancies and resilience. I have to caution, however, that global trade has actually grown despite all these shocks that have happened recently, right? It grew at 3.2% last year. For 2026, it's expected to grow about 3.3%, which shows that global trade is actually chugging along.
Right.
However, what's driving the current trajectory of global trade and progress is actually this AI boom. And I sort of worry about that because currently, if you look at the numbers, AI is still unstable and it's still sort of forming a bit of a bubble in a way, and that actually feeds into the US economy in terms of its stock market. So 40% of American GDP last year was driven by AI, the building of data centers, the purchases of capital expenditure by companies like Google and now Amazon and OpenAI and what was it called? Anthropod or something like that. Yeah. So what's happening right now is that these companies are actually highly overextended and overvalued because there's not really much productive capacity, or not productive capacity, or consumption of AI.
Right, but here's a comment from the WTO that in fact they've highlighted that the future of AI in trade will depend on supporting infrastructure, education, and open markets as well. So that is in consideration. I know that is a point to ponder on for you, but let's come to the crux of it, Trump and what recently happened at the courts as well. There was his move to include announcements on tariffs across the board. How does this affect the overall standing of smaller economies? And as an economist, what are your thoughts really about what has happened? Because this is sort of a recurring pattern now as well.
Are you talking about Trump, the unilateral Trump tariffs, and the recent Supreme Court decision to overturn those tariffs from 19% back to 15%? If that's the case, then I think what this demonstrates is really the US is increasingly an unstable trade partner. It's an unstable and I never thought I'd say this, but it's becoming clearer and clearer that US institutions have not been able to stand against the onslaught of Trumpism. In a way, you saw the fact that Trump is able to announce these unilateral tariffs when in actual fact the tariffs are supposed to be ratified by Congress. Which is, I think, why the Supreme Court declared them to be illegal. But then Trump then replies that, no, I'm going to then impose tariffs again. So this creates a lot of instability and unpredictability in the system. Then I question whether or not the global superpowers or the powers that be should actually entertain this sort of man-child, as it were, who really thinks that conducting geopolitics and geoeconomics is like a child that doesn't get his favorite toy and then throws a tantrum, and then you're supposed to entertain him in a way. And in essence, this also indicates that any negotiations with the US may be conducted not quite in good faith, because you don't know whether they can abide or whether they will abide by those agreements.
Right, but as this trade winds shift, perhaps middle-income economies do stand a chance or do have an advantage in terms of investment shifts as well. So how does this pan out for a nation like ours?
Oh, there's a large number of opportunities, right, I would think, for smaller income economies, as long as they still believe that there's power in numbers. So for small income economies, there's always going to be the need to actually band together with other small income economies. So we have ASEAN. I think we should really start leveraging on ASEAN as a global economic and trading bloc in order to be able to hedge against any shifts in geopolitics or geoeconomic headwinds, right? So for instance, ASEAN is, each individual country in ASEAN, bar Indonesia, is a small open economy. But if we band it together, we're one of the largest trading blocs in the world. And for that's a large bargaining chip that we can have in order to negotiate for better terms, in order to ensure that we can hedge against any headwinds that appear, not just because of geopolitical issues, but also, there could be certain rulings that come from perhaps the EU or China that we have to inoculate ourselves against. And this really builds into the need for more resiliency in the system.
Can we take the stand of sticking our ground to being a neutral trade hub as we are strategically positioned here in Southeast Asia?
I think we should. I think it is only to our benefit for us to remain neutral. And we've always been part of, historically we were always part of the non-aligned movement, right, during the Cold War. And I don't think that it would actually be to our benefit to actually choose one side over the other, as long as I think we were dealing with these other economic powers in good faith, I would say. I do worry, however, when there are agreements such as the recent ART that had a stipulation in it that said that the US can actually dictate who we trade with. For instance, if we were trading with a country that they deemed on their sanctions list, for instance, so would that mean that we wouldn't be able to trade with, say, Iran, which is on the US sanctions list? or in the future, if they had any more problems with China, could that be a problem for us?
How firm or strategic do you think Malaysia as a trading nation is at this point of time?
I think currently we're quite safe in a way, because I spoke about the ART, but I think the good thing about that is it's yet to be ratified either by Malaysia, and it doesn't look like it's going to be ratified by the US if we're lucky. However, if such agreement actually comes to fruition, then we kind of be part of a chipping away of our bargaining chip, because that's sort of the US actually dividing and ruling, because it's just an agreement with us, Malaysia. It's not an agreement with ASEAN that has a larger bargaining power compared to one similar country. And you can see from the agreement that it's not like any other trade agreement that's historically been signed. It's got some odd provisions in there, I would say, like the commitment to buy certain things that really aren't in any normal or regular trade agreement.
What's the upside of this all? We're talking about tariffs and the play of power and actions and overhaul of systems. What is the positive side of this? Do give us some hope for the next quarter of 2026.
Oh boy. I always think that there's always opportunity in crisis, but in order to grasp those opportunities, you would have had to learn the lessons from history, right? It's an opportunity to overhaul the system. So I would love to be optimistic, but at the same time, whilst the Director General of the WTO has mentioned that there needs to be reform in the system.
Yes.
In the next breath, you see that actually now it's still the US that's actually directing the trajectory of the next WTO ministerial that's happening in March. They're talking about unilateral tariffs, which is contravening the idea of a global trading system in the first place. So I would say that the only upside is it gives us opportunity to actually overhaul, but you don't want to hit rock bottom or even below that to actually start overhauling and reforming.
But what the WTO has also said, that the reforms must be deep rather than just incremental. So
yeah,
from an economic standpoint then, what would you say are the most urgent reforms?
I think the most urgent reforms are in terms of the dispute resolution, right? You can see that one of the weaknesses in terms of the dispute resolution is, as I mentioned, the fact that the US can actually appoint adjudicators or mediators to the dispute resolution system, which means that it has not yet been penalized for imposing these unilateral tariffs. That's one way. I think there's always been a key reform that's been pointed out and sorely needed in the WTO. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is obviously for the WTO to equip its smaller members that are less powerful to be able to negotiate at a level playing field compared to the larger superpowers, because what's been happening at the WTO, as it's been happening in other multilateral institutions, is that obviously the larger powers have a lot more bargaining power than the smaller countries and tend to dictate the trajectory of those countries. I think if there was signs that was happening, then that would give me even more cause to be optimistic.
Are there any top trends in terms of what is redefining global trade at this point of time?
Obviously, the AI evolution that's really driving trade at the moment. I'm a bit cautious about that because, as I mentioned, it's still sort of a bubble in the sense that these companies are building data centers which take up a lot of natural resources that haven't been calculated in terms of the cost, right? We build the data centers, but they require a lot of not just water, but also in terms of natural resources like rare earths and minerals, which are mined from third world countries that are not politically stable, right? So that's another issue where geopolitics and economics actually intertwine. But it is a trend, it's growing, but it could form into quite a major bubble that could actually lead to the same sorts of developments that we saw during the global financial crisis if we're not careful.
We look ahead to 2026 and beyond. Are you cautiously optimistic or now becoming increasingly concerned about the future of global trade, where we're headed, perhaps even some checkpoints or milestones that we need to be, taking note of? What will determine the direction the world needs to steer the ship towards?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for some time, and I sort of feel that the world now is in the same sort of geopolitical space as it was a century ago. After World War I in the 1920s, we were seeing a sort of gilded age happening in the US where there's a K-shaped economy, right? Where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, but you don't see it in terms of the major economic numbers because the growth is being driven by, say, the top 10% economy of the income and wealth earners. But then you're going to see narrowing of the margins and deterioration in living quality for those who can least afford it. And I worry if that sort of K-shaped economy is transmitted to other countries as well, especially given developments such as AI, which will generally negatively impact labor demand. And the workforce. So I think that's something that we need to be very cautious about. The other sort of development that I think we need to keep a watch on is any sort of political developments in the global superpowers. I think we've seen the damage that a march towards right-wing fascism can do, looking at the US, and that will generally obviously disrupt global economics, never mind our world peace, in a way, because fascist countries generally are isolationist countries. They'll fragment the trading system. So if you see the growth of right-wing parties in countries such as France, I'd be cautious about that as well, because currently what's putting a flaw against any disruption to the global trade system is the strength of the EU itself as a sort of bulwark against any further deterioration of global economic and trading systems.
How would you summarize what we have spoken about, but also from your lens in terms of short-term action, and then on the very other extreme, the overhaul of the WTO, because the WTO has also, part of their agenda is to prioritize integrating SMEs, and that's also, for us here in Malaysia, SMEs form a large part of our of our business and our infrastructure in terms of our GDP as well. So in perspective, where does that leave us?
I think any short-term action, I think it's high time we sort of abandon double-speak in a way, because whilst the WTO does give lip service to reform and SMEs, at the end of the day, it's still sort of listening to the US. I was going to say subservient, but it's not really, because it will actually say that the US is directing its next agenda. So what does that tell us? That it's not really being serious about these reforms, right? And we have to face facts at the moment, because whatever it is, we can't deny the fact that the world is facing headlong into a sort of existential environmental crisis that needs to be faced urgently. And this has links and ramifications with geopolitics, political developments, as well as the need to narrow inequality within countries and between countries as well. So, I mean, these are huge issues, but I think the first step that we need to take is actually to be completely honest and frank within our systems and ourselves, to say that, okay, we should actually proceed with caution, but also believe that there are strength in numbers, and who do we ally with and who do we not ally with?
That's a question that's constantly needs to be answered, but also, the waves keep changing, because one day it's this and the next day it's that. From an economist perspective, in terms of opening the daily news and looking at these numbers that are quite jumpy at this point of time, what is that doing for economists worldwide, Nadia?
I can't speak for my brethren, unfortunately, but what it's doing to this economist is the thought that, my God, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, because you keep seeing developments that have occurred before. So the sort of AI bubble that's happening is pretty much reminiscent of the subprime bubble in a way, because what you have is these big companies that are actually requiring credit, and they're being funded now by debt, and that debt is being taken on by retail investors now. So if there's any crash in that AI bubble, especially in the US, that's going to develop into that's going to descend into a crash similar to that subprime bubble, and you're like, okay, this is happening. It's happened before. We need to actually put a stop to this. So I would actually watch over those areas. And what we as small open economies or Malaysia can do is actually build resilience against those risks, right? diversify our export partners, diversify our exports.
Building resilience and diversifying. Nadia,
Yes.
thanks for coming in. Now, as geopolitical tensions continue to influence global and regional markets, we need to adapt. And the fact that there is, and it does involve some amount of strategic planning, these factors will be key for economies navigating uncertainty. I'm Jessie Chahal. Thanks for watching The Nation and thanks for listening to this conversation. Do keep it locked on to Bernama TV for more conversations that matter. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.